the good professor chair at the Department of Economics and associate professor of economics, Josh Hendrickson. Good morning, Professor. How are you? It's good to have you, sir.
I'm great. Good to be here.
All right, multitude of things. I played this one yesterday, day before yesterday. Well, yesterday. Yesterday was Monday. And I thought I wanted you to hear this one, too, and comment on this one, because one of the first topics I wanted to touch base with you was the world of digital currency, and are we going to be able to stop this one way or the other? Or for that matter, if we know more about it, do we want to stop it? But your thoughts on digital currency?
Well, when we think about these proposals for central bank digital currency, it's kind of like a solution that's like looking for a problem. So it's not actually clear what problem that this solves. So what you hear people say is, oh, well, this is going to be used to like bank the unbanked, right? They'll be able to have this digital currency through the central bank that'll, that'll help out people who don't have access to banks. Well, if you look at people who don't have access to banks or who don't use banks, the number one complaint that they have is they don't trust the bank. So if they don't trust the bank, we're supposed to believe that they're going to trust the Federal Reserve. That doesn't make any sense to me. The other thing is that if you're banking the unbanked, aren't you competing with commercial banks? And they say, oh, no, we're not competing with commercial banks because we won't have competitive interest rates with commercial banks. Well, okay, so you're going to offer this product that you want everybody to use to help get more people banked, but it's going to be less desirable than things that already exist. So it's like a Yogi Berra-ism. It's like it's going to be so great that nobody's going to use it, right?
Is it? It's a little bit like the autonomous cars that work with all of the technology we have. You have the ability to drive hands-free, but you're trading a lot of other things for them. Well, that's true in just about every kind of technology. Here's what the report was on the digital world in China. It seems like every time they come up with something new as far as technology, it's used kind of to keep the people in control. At the same time, you say you're helping them.
So in China, for example, if a traffic camera catches you jaywalking in China.
By the way, this is, and I know people, I recognize that voice. It's Jordan Peters.
For example, if a traffic camera catches you jaywalking in China, the digital ID system has you. It has your blood now. It has your genetic code. It has your photograph. It can identify how you walk, so even if you can't see a face, you can be picked up by gait. It will convict you of jaywalking and take money out of your bank account with no intermediating judiciary at all, and show a picture of you to the people in the neighborhood so they know that you have jaywalked, and reduce your social credit score. And if your social credit score falls below a certain level, then you can't buy drinks from a vending machine. You can't play video games. You can't go on a train. You can't get out of your 15-minute city.
Wow.
All that's already in place in China. The digital ID system has you.
That's absolutely.
So in China, has your blood, for example. If a traffic camera...
This is just, now it's taken over, the computer's taken over me here, but that's what's going on in China right now. Every technology is used in one way or the other to control the people a little bit more. And wouldn't digital currency do that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of points here. Number one, I would point out that central bank digital currency isn't actually any sort of technological innovation. Like, we don't need any kind of new technology to operate a central bank digital currency. I mean, your bank already offers digital money, right? The money that's in your bank account, you're swiping your debit card, things like that. You're spending that money digitally all the time. You buy things on the internet. Yeah. So they don't actually need, this isn't actually driven by technology. And that's an important point. And the reason it's an important point is that if you think about currency, as we think about it, currency has two characteristics. One, it's peer-to-peer, right? Like if I buy something with cash, I'm buying it directly from this other person. The only people who are part of that transaction are me and the person that I'm buying the product from. And so there's some degree, what that means is there's some degree of privacy. With central bank digital currency, this is not peer-to-peer. There's an intermediary, and that intermediary is the central bank. And they're observing every sort of transaction that you're making, so there is no privacy whatsoever. And so this gives unprecedented access of the Federal Reserve to know exactly what people are spending. And so you hear these stories like China. I mean, this is what you're concerned about, is that governments will use this information to start regulating your behavior.
Professor Josh Hendrickson, where would the credit card companies fit into this? Would they be needed? Would they be sucking off some of the percentages for handling it?
Well, I think one of the challenges that central banks are going to face, at least in democratic countries, is that there's going to be a lot of political pressure that's coming from the commercial banking sector to say, no, we don't want this, right? Because they're going to see this as competition with the services that they provide, like the central bank providing a digital currency. I mean, really what they're providing is not so much a digital currency. They're providing bank accounts directly at the central bank is what they're really doing. And so they're actually competing more with commercial banks. And so the commercial banks, I think, are going to push back on this a lot, because they don't want the competition, because it's not an even playing field if you're a commercial bank and you're competing against the Federal Reserve.
Is it stoppable? Do you think sooner or later, I mean, we're going to be faced with that? Certainly as other countries go to that. Is it something that inevitable in maybe within 10 years?
Well, I think that when it comes to central bank digital currency, this is something that we could prevent, because this is something that requires the Federal Reserve to create. And the Federal Reserve doesn't have the legal authority to create it. They would have to be given the legal authority to create it by Congress. And so in order to prevent it, it's going to require a political solution. It's going to require that people put pressure on Congress not to allow the Federal Reserve to do this in the first place.
Let me switch gears here just a little bit on the national debt. And those are figures. You almost need a supercomputer to start analyzing this when you start getting into this. How much longer do we have before the rapture? And I'm talking about the economic rapture. Is that also inevitable if we continue to do what we're doing now?
Yeah, pretty much all the numbers that you look at point to the fact that our debt is unsustainable. The path that we're on cannot be sustained. Even like the Congressional Budget Office, their projections through 2054 are that the deficit, the annual deficit, not just the debt, the annual deficit is going to grow relative to GDP. And so that means that our government's debt is going to be growing faster than total income in the entire economy for the next 30 years. And if you look at that, the reason that this is the case is they're not even projecting that the spending is actually going to get out of control. What they're starting to project is that the interest costs on the debt are going to start to be the main driver of this increase in our debt. So we've gotten to the point where our debt is so high, just the interest payments on the debt are just compounding this at such a fast rate that we're not keeping up in terms of economic growth.
Why don't people understand this? It's something we're not taught in school. Basically, just the analogy is so easy and so good, and we'll talk more about it after this break. But it's so easy. You get your paycheck, and let's say it's $500, and at the end of the month, that $500 goes directly just to pay your credit card charges, the interest on your credit card charges, not even the charges itself. And so it's an easy example, but apparently nobody can understand that. We'll have more coming up next. At Ole Miss, you know, when we were growing up, we always had this thing about who's going to be the first guy on the moon. What's his name going to be? And now maybe it'll be who's going to be the person. What's the name of the person who's going to write this memo? We are sorry to inform you that your Social Security check has insufficient funds. So, I'm not sure who's going to write that memo. But sooner or later, when we talk about Social Security or any other subsidy or any other retirement benefits from the government, if the government doesn't have it, it's going to bounce.
Yeah, I mean, we face a real problem here. And the problem is that if you want to solve this problem, you've either got to raise taxes or you got to cut spending. And we're sort of at the point where doing just one of the two of those things is not going to solve the problem, because the biggest, our largest expenditures are things that are not going to get cut, right? We're not going to cut Medicare. We're not going to cut Social Security. We're not going to cut defense. And And those are the three. Those are the three biggest tangible purchases that we're making, right? Actually, though, the second largest purchase that we're making, the second largest line item in our budget is now interest payments. So that's a huge problem.
Yes.
But I think that actually the bigger concern is when you think about it from that perspective. I think that over time, it's kind of much more likely that what's going to happen is they're going to try to kind of inflate away the debt, or be forced to inflate away the debt, right? Like they're going to be the Federal Reserve is going to be forced to over time buy larger amounts of government debt, and then hold that debt. In which case, they're effectively monetizing the debt. And so you might still get your Social Security check that you were promised. It's just that the purchasing power of that check is going to be substantially lower than what you expected.
What happens to the debt we owe, let's say China? Is that negotiable? Is that to a point where somewhere in this country, for instance, and I really believe that if Trump had gotten a second term, he was going to go say, look, you guys, you have the Wuhan virus. You caused this amount of damage. We are going to sue you for that. I'm not in a world court aware, but do you think that is something that will be addressed in the years to come?
Well, I think that part of the reason that we're in this position in the first place is that because the dollar is the global reserve currency of the world, people are willing to buy our debt because they can have this liquid asset that earns interest and that can easily be turned into dollars. And so we've been able to run up more debt than we would be able to if the dollar wasn't the global reserve currency. But sort of the problem here is that actually, if you start looking at the data, a lot of countries are starting to reduce their holdings of treasuries. Like China has already been reducing their treasury holdings, and the government is already starting to kind of freak out about this. You hear them talking about how they need to find passive buyers of our debt, and this is compounded by the fact that in the last really in the last 20 years, the United States has also started to use that role as the issuer of the global reserve currency to also use that power for financial sanctions. When they start using this for financial sanctions, there are countries around the world that are kind of like, hey, if they can seize our assets, maybe we don't want to hold those assets in the United States, or maybe we don't want to hold treasuries in the first place. And so you've got this growing debt, compounded by the possibility of sanctions. And so there are a lot of countries that used to be really passive buyers of our debt who've been kind of scaling back on their debt purchases, which then makes the path that we're on even more unsustainable.
But as that happens and the dollar loses favor globally, what do we coalesce around as far as the world monetary? Is it a certain in what country? Do we go to Italy? Do we go to Russia? What are we talking about as far as taking the place of the dollar? Or maybe is it Bitcoins?
Well, I think that's kind of the big question that's out there. I think one of the reasons that the United States has been so hesitant to kind of give up any sort of role in being in terms of being the dominant issuer of currency is that it conveys a lot of economic and political power for the United States to have that. And the thing that the United States is afraid of is they're afraid that if they relinquish that power, they're going to be relinquishing it to some other country, and then that other country will have the power.
Yes.
And I think that what you're observing, though, is I think that a lot of people are starting to look at this and move towards a system where they're like, well, maybe there should be some neutral asset that people go to. I mean, one of the things that some of these foreign central banks are doing is they're buying gold. It's probably too early to talk about Bitcoin as a reserve asset, but certainly at some point in the future that could be an option.
Yeah. And if you've seen the price of gold lately, I think it's well over $2,000 an ounce. It's not bad at all. I have no idea. It must be the inflation, because it took our time away. It went too fast here. We need a little bit more. Don't be a stranger. Got to get you back on, because there are a lot of other things I wanted to talk to you about. Appreciate you joining us, though. Thank you, sir. That is
Thanks for having me.
The good Professor Josh Hendrickson, Chair of the Department of Economics and Associate Professor of Economics